When Prairie Women's Health Centre of Excellence began, it took on a role as a granting agency, and people were invited to submit proposals to do new research on a variety of themes, but one of those was research related to Aboriginal women, because our board recognized that a large proportion of the population here are Aboriginal women, and also because there was a real shortage of new research that came directly from the voices of women themselves. So when I came to Prairie Women's Health Centre of Excellence, it was the year 2000, and it had already been in operation since 1996. Soon after I came in as the executive director, we had a chance to renew ourselves and to reconfigure.
A really important piece of work was the synthesis document. I think really helped to establish the path forward and guide the direction of the work that Prairie Women's has done with Aboriginal women. Madeleine Dion Stout was hired to produce this document that would give Prairie Women's an idea as to what's out there just in terms of gender equity and Aboriginal women, what's out there in terms of employment, like what do we know about employment and Aboriginal women, really looking at the social determinants of health, what is the evidence that's out there. And I think that document really guided the work of not just Prairie Women's but also the work of the other centers. And when you wanted to start some kind of program on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis women, you can't really start without knowing what's there, without really getting the evidence.
We wanted to offer an infrastructure where the research could be done by Aboriginal women themselves without having to go through extra hurdles. So our first attempt was that in each city of Saskatoon and Winnipeg, we invited notable women who were considered credible and trustworthy, to each facilitate a workshop of women of their gathering to ask them what topics interested each set of women. To talk about what would this look like, how would the research be done, and then what the topic would be. The local women chose the topic, and then we invited a committee from the larger group to work with us to hire a researcher, refine the research question, and oversee and supervise the research entirely. So what we provided was an infrastructure for community women to get work done and research done that was important to them. Projects in Saskatoon and Winnipeg gave us the impetus to move on to new work. We had, I think, built some trust in the community, and we had essentially let it be known that we were going to go about our work in a different way.
Some of the work that we were doing was really defining what is health, what is wellness, from that Aboriginal women's point of view, which I think in those days was really missing from that larger discussion, and getting Aboriginal women's experiences into the health frame, into that health dialogue, into that paradigm of health. Planting the seeds for that, getting the academics together, but also incorporating that community perspective.
The workshops are really important because it can be kind of a lonely place doing the work that we do, especially when you're doing research in Indigenous communities and trying to think through Indigenous methodologies and what they do. And so that was one of the things that the workshops that Prairie Women's hosted offered, was that opportunity to have kind of a peer engagement, a peer dialogue around research practice, and in particular Indigenous methodologies, Indigenous research practice.
Over the next few years at Prairie Women's, as we became more confident in our own work and I think gained some credibility among Aboriginal communities and agencies, the work began to self-propel. So each year when we were considering what new projects we would undertake, We would solicit ideas from community. We would have staff who could advise on policy opportunities and research gaps. Board members also took a lead in making lists of places you should go and things you should investigate.
There was things happening at the level of the board, getting more Aboriginal, First Nations and Métis women onto the board so that, they could also use their networks.
Okay, at the same time as we were going about our own work inside Prairie Women's in different ways, I also worked with the board and the staff to create a different workplace. So we made sure that the complement of women on our board included as many Aboriginal women as were interested in joining and from a multitude of backgrounds. And similarly, endeavored to bring women onto staff who could provide knowledge and skills, would be recognized in the community, and bring an Aboriginal women's perspective right into Prairie Women so that we could really strengthen our knowledge as an operating center and through the research that we did.
I think that the first thing that we needed to learn and have learned is that we really needed to be able to have a really deep understanding of the impact that colonization has had on not only our community, but also on the settler community in terms of how that shaped people's particular ideologies, people's attitudes, people's behaviors, people's sense of who they are and how they're socially constructed and how Indigenous people are socially constructed. So then, once we have addressed those things, and these are personal things, these are systematic things in terms of the organization and how it supports people to engage in these processes, but it's also deeply personal as well. I think that from my experience in Prairie Women's Health Center of Excellence, that they started that dialogue. I know I was on the board for several years, and I remember getting those kinds of conversations on the agenda. I think it's really been really positive experience from Gani-Ganichik's perspective, especially around the Voices Project, the residential school survivors, the second generation. I think that was very powerful and very positive for the community women just to be able to participate in that. So I really value that. And I think the quality of that was in the leadership around both Prairie Women's Health Center of Excellence and the people that came from Gani-Ganichik.
Prairie Women, I think, really laid a strong foundation for Aboriginal women to participate at the board level and to be employees, right? So because when I was working, I had the Aboriginal Women's Health File, and then that went on to other people, and now there was Roberta that was in that role, right? So there's been that consistent attention to the health of First Nations and Métis women, and throughout the years the programming has become stronger.
In some ways, I would say that working on Aboriginal women's health at Prairie Women's has been a lot about being able to go into different streams of research and knowing that I'm not an expert in any of those streams, and that's not my role as a researcher here. My role is to facilitate the research so that Aboriginal women's issues are brought out, and recognizing that they are the experts. What I've seen, particularly through the digital stories, is the Digital Stories project that we've done at Prairie Women's on residential schools, that the knowledge holders represent themselves. And to me, that is an example of how I would love to see research continue in the future. That's probably why I feel the projects that I've done here have been so significant and meaningful to me. It's me leading the research as an Aboriginal person within the organization and being supported by the board and by an executive director who recognizes the importance of Aboriginal people doing Aboriginal research.
the thing that is really significant about a place like Prairie Women's is that you have the research connected with policy and action, right? And so to have those things situated in one place gives it so much more strength in terms of being able to affect change.
One of the real privileges we've had at Prairie Women's is with our federal mandate for the work that we did, we had the opportunities to disseminate our information and address policy issues at all different levels. So in the case of our work specific to Aboriginal women, we could move outside of the prairies and outside of our own little center of excellence to share that information and the learnings. And then it became very much perpetuating and self-sustaining with our colleagues across the country, so that in that way not only did the evidence grow, but the networks grew as well. So I wanted to give you a few examples. I mentioned earlier that inside the federal government there was a new position created specific to Aboriginal women's health issues within the Bureau of Women's Health, as it was called, or Women's Health Bureau. And the relationship that we had with that civil servant allowed us to grow the work outside of the prairies. So I could say to her, we've done an interesting piece on gender-based analysis, and she could say to us, oh, you know, I've been thinking a lot about culturally based gender-based analysis, and I could say back to her, that's really interesting. I know someone who wants to do it with one of the national governing bodies. And she would find the money to make it happen. And this happened several times where we would draw upon each other's knowledge, but also each other's networks to see where the next gap was and where we wanted to take that information.
Use a lot of their tools even in my current work. They're my go-to research people. They're my go-to, you know, real work from the community level that has quality to it. In a lot of ways, what I used it with was in my non-Aboriginal partners at a government level to give them a concept of what we're talking about when we talk about Aboriginal wellness or Aboriginal health, and especially around Aboriginal women's health, was to give them a sense of what the facts were, but what the story behind the facts were. And that's a piece that the Prairie Centre has always done. They've always been able to capture that background piece that tells you the real story in a way that allows you to understand and feel what the truth of the matter is. So I used that a lot when I was giving examples to national Aboriginal organizations, co-workers, or when I was trying to present to colleagues at other branches within the department why we would need to continue to do research or to fund specific projects with Aboriginal women's health in particular. And probably the biggest piece of research that I used in the latter part of my work with Health Canada related specifically to the photo diary and the digital stories. So being able to take the photo diaries that were done of women's perceptions of their world and their environment. So while we say we spend this amount of money on Aboriginal health and Aboriginal wellness, this is still the realities of people living in certain areas of this country, and certainly with the Aboriginal population in particular.
We had opportunities to take on contracts with the federal government. So for instance, we were asked to look at the federal maternal and child health programs and whether they were having the reach and outreach that they was first envisaged. And that became an enormous project, so then we focused it down to, well, what's happening for the on-reserve programs, and developed a paper looking at across the country, following the money, looking at what the intentions of those programs were and what the outcomes were and where there were gaps. And likewise looked at what is known about environmental contaminants and their effects on maternal and child health.
As we're entering a different stage where there's not going to be the centers of excellence for women's health, I mean, there's a lot to ponder. I mean, it's just women's health in general. How will that passion and commitment be sustained, right? But also, where do we go from here, and how do we continue that gender-based analysis, and that women's health agenda, that First Nations women's health agenda. I think it's really important to have maybe another synthesis document as to what has been done and what still is left to do, and also who has benefited from this research.
I have a lot of confidence in Aboriginal women doing research for Aboriginal women.
It's a shame to see these organizations that we've built that have recognized the capacity that you have once you start to pull those things together under one roof. And maybe it's just a question of setting up networks to be able to continue some of the work that was able to be housed in one place. Maybe there's some kind of bodies that can continue to try to keep an eye on all of that, those connecting pieces and those bigger pieces about how those things are going to move and feed each other, and how they can call upon each other to do the work that needs to be done.
There's a rich bounty that each person who's been involved with the center has been able to gather. We'll take that basket full and replant, reseed, and share that with other people. For us, it's like those original teachings. They blossom, they grow, and they do all of that when we share them.